George Strait stops his car after hearing a homeless elderly woman playing his song, "What Happens Next Will Make You Cry." The autumn rain fell steadily on the cracked sidewalks of Nashville's Music Row, each droplet carrying with it the dreams and disappointments of countless musicians who had walked these streets before. The grey October sky seemed to mirror the weight that 72-year-old Martha Johnson carried in her heart as she carefully positioned her weathered guitar case on the wet pavement outside Tootsie's Orchid Lounge. Her arthritic fingers, once nimble enough to guide elementary school children through their first piano lessons, now trembled slightly as she tuned the old acoustic guitar that had become her lifeline. Martha's once silver hair, dampened by the persistent drizzle, framed a face that still held traces of the vibrant music teacher she had been for over 3 decades. Her blue eyes, though clouded with worry and exhaustion, still sparkled with an inner strength that 47 years of marriage to Tom Johnson had nurtured and refined. She wore a simple navy cardigan, thin from countless washings, over a floral dress that had seen better days but was kept meticulously clean despite her circumstances. The guitar in her hands was a 1976 Martin D28, a wedding gift from Tom that had serenaded countless students and filled their modest home with music for nearly 5 decades. Now, its once pristine finish bore the scars of weather and necessity, but its voice remained true and warm, just like the woman who played it. As Martha began her first song of the day, her fingers found the familiar chords of Amarillo by Morning, with an ease born of countless repetitions, but this was no mere street performance for spare change. Each note she played was a prayer, each chord a promise to the man who lay in the Sunset Manor nursing home just 12 miles away, his brilliant mind slowly being stolen by Alzheimer's disease. Tom had been her anchor for so long that sometimes Martha forgot where she ended, and he began. They had met at a country dance in 1975, when she was a young music teacher fresh out of college, and he was a gentle-hearted carpenter with calloused hands and dreams of building beautiful things. Amarillo by Morning had been playing on the old jukebox when he first asked her to dance, his shy smile melting her heart instantly. If you are watching from Nashville, Texas, California, or anywhere else in this beautiful country, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you are joining us from. We love hearing your stories and connecting with fellow music lovers who understand the power of a good song to heal hearts and bring people together. Your support means the world to us. Their courtship had been a melody of shared dreams and simple pleasures. Tom would bring his guitar to her apartment, and they would spend hours playing together, her voice blending perfectly with his in harmonies that seemed destined by Providence. When he proposed on a warm spring evening in 1976, Amarillo by Morning was playing softly on her stereo, and when she said yes through tears of joy, he had whispered that their love would last longer than any song ever written. Their wedding dance had been to that same song, and later, when their son David was born, Tom would hold the baby while Martha played that familiar melody, watching their child's eyes grow heavy with sleep. David had grown up surrounded by music, and though he had chosen a different path as an engineer, he had inherited his parents' love for the authentic, heartfelt songs that told real stories about real people. But David was gone now, taken in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway 3 years ago, leaving behind a silence that even Martha's music could not entirely fill. The grief had accelerated Tom's decline, and watching her husband of over 4 decades slowly disappear into the fog of dementia had been the cruelest symphony Martha had ever been forced to hear. The nursing home was expensive, far more than their modest savings and Tom's carpenter pension could cover. Martha had sold their house, their car, and most of their possessions to ensure Tom received the best care possible. She had moved into a tiny efficiency apartment and taken on piano lessons for neighborhood children, But even that income was not enough to cover the mounting medical bills and the small comforts that made Tom's remaining lucid moments more bearable. So Martha had taken to the streets, her guitar case open to collect donations from passers-by who might be touched by her music. She was not begging, she told herself. She was sharing the gift that had sustained her through nearly 3/4 of a century of living, and if people chose to contribute to Tom's care in return, then perhaps there was still some goodness left in a world that had taken so much from her. The rain continued to fall as Martha Dess' voice rose above the sound of traffic and distant conversations. Her rendition of Amarillo by Morning carried a depth of emotion that only someone who had lived every word could deliver. She sang of morning coming, of hope returning, of love enduring through the darkest nights, and passers-by found themselves stopping despite the weather, drawn by something in her voice that spoke to their own hidden longings and remembered loves. A young couple, probably honeymooners visiting Nashville for the first time, stopped and listened with tears in their eyes. The man dropped a $20 bill into her case and whispered to his bride that they should request that song for their first dance at their reception. An elderly businessman, reminded of his own late wife, added another $10 and stood listening until Martha finished the song, his umbrella forgotten as rain dampened his expensive suit. But not everyone who passed understood the dignity in Martha's mission. 3 young men in designer jeans and pristine cowboy boots approached her corner, laughing loudly and clearly having enjoyed too many drinks at lunch. They worked for Pinnacle Records, as their conversation revealed, and they carried themselves with the arrogance of men who believed their association with the music industry made them somehow superior to the woman creating actual music on the street corner. "Look at this," sneered the tallest one, whose name tag read Brad Mitchell, A&R assistant. "Another old-timer who doesn't know when to hang up the guitar. Probably thinks she is going to be discovered right here on Broadway." His companions laughed as Brad pulled out his phone and began recording Martha, not out of appreciation, but as material for later mockery. "This is what happens when people don't plan for retirement," he said loudly enough for Martha to hear. They end up making noise on street corners, bothering people who are trying to enjoy their day. Martha's fingers never faltered on the guitar strings, but her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the rain. She had faced skepticism and condescension before, but each cruel word still stung, especially when delivered by young people who had been given opportunities in the music world that she could only dream of at their age. The security guard from the nearby souvenir shop emerged from his post, having been watching the interaction unfold. He said to Martha, his voice not unkind but firm. "I am going to have to ask you to move along. Some of the customers have complained about the noise, and it is bad for business on a day like this when folks just want to get inside and dry off." Martha nodded wordlessly, her weathered hands beginning to pack away her guitar with the practiced efficiency of someone who had faced rejection many times before. The rain seemed to fall harder as she closed her case, and for a moment the weight of her circumstances threatened to crush the spirit that had carried her through so many challenges. As she stood to leave, guitar case in hand, Martha made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking away in defeat, she opened her case one final time, positioned her fingers on the familiar frets, and began to play Amarillo by Morning, with a passion that seemed to defy the grey October sky. Her voice, strengthened by decades of teaching children to find their own musical voices, rose above the sound of rain and traffic with a clarity that made even Brad Mitchell pause his cruel commentary. 3 blocks away, in the back seat of a black Lincoln Navigator, sat a man whose presence on these same Nashville streets had become the stuff of legend. George Harvey Strait, known to millions simply as the king of country music, was reviewing notes for an upcoming meeting with his record label executives. At 69 years old, he had achieved everything a country artist could dream of achieving. 60 #1 hits, 13 multi-platinum albums, and a career spanning over 4 decades had secured his place in music history. But success, George had learned, could be both a blessing and a burden. The music industry had changed dramatically since his early days, and sometimes he felt like a relic from a simpler time when songs told real stories about real people facing real challenges. The meeting he was heading to would likely involve discussions about streaming numbers, social media engagement, and demographic targeting, all important business considerations that somehow seemed far removed from the reason he had fallen in love with music in the first place. His driver, Eddie Ramirez, had been with George for 8 years and had learned to read his employer's moods with remarkable accuracy. Today, he sensed a restlessness in the legendary singer, a quality that had become more pronounced in recent months as George wrestled with questions about his artistic legacy and the direction of his later career. "Mr. Strait," Eddie said, glancing in the rearview mirror as they approached the intersection of Broadway and 4th Avenue, "would you like me to take the back route to avoid some of this traffic? Looks like there is quite a crowd gathered up ahead." George looked up from his notes and peered through the rain-streaked window. That was when he heard it, a melody so familiar it might have been his own heartbeat, floating through the Nashville air with a purity that made him forget about contracts and marketing strategies. Someone was playing Amarillo by Morning, and they were playing it with the kind of emotional authenticity that had inspired him to write the song in the first place. "Stop the car," George said suddenly, his voice carrying an urgency that surprised both himself and Eddie. "Sir?" Eddie asked, uncertain he had heard correctly. "Stop the car right here, Eddie. I need to hear this." As the navigator pulled to the curb, George rolled down his window despite the rain and listened more intently. The voice carrying his song belonged to a woman, probably older, and she was singing it not as a performance but as a prayer. Each note weighted with experiences that only someone who had truly lived could understand. Through the crowd of curious onlookers who had gathered despite the weather, George could see the source of the music. An elderly woman with silver hair sat on a small folding stool, her guitar case open at her feet, playing his song with a reverence that brought unexpected tears to his eyes. She was not trying to impress anyone or prove anything. She was simply sharing a piece of her soul through music, the way country music was meant to be shared. "Eddie," George said quietly, "I need to get closer to this." Without waiting for a response, George opened the car door and stepped into the October rain. He pulled his black cowboy hat lower over his eyes, not out of any desire for disguise, but simply from habit, and began walking toward the woman whose voice had stopped him in his tracks. As he drew nearer, George could see the details that the distance had hidden. The woman's guitar was old but well-maintained, obviously cherished despite its worn appearance. Her clothes were simple and showed signs of repeated washing, but they were clean and pressed. Most importantly, her face revealed a depth of emotion that spoke of both tremendous love and profound loss. The small crowd around her had grown quiet, sensing that something special was happening. Even the 3 young men who had been mocking her earlier had fallen silent, though they maintained their skeptical expressions. The security guard who had asked her to move along stood awkwardly to one side, uncertain whether to enforce his earlier directive given the obvious appreciation of the gathering audience. Martha herself seemed lost in the music. Her eyes closed as she sang the final verse of Amarillo by Morning. Her voice, though weathered by age and circumstances, carried a truth that no amount of studio polish could replicate. She sang of morning coming and love enduring, and every person listening knew that she understood exactly what those words meant. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of silence that occurs when people have witnessed something real and beautiful and need a moment to process the experience. Rain continued to fall on the gathered crowd, but no one seemed in a hurry to seek shelter. That was when George Strait stepped forward from the crowd, his presence still unnoticed by Martha, who was carefully placing her guitar back in its case. The rain had darkened his hat and shirt, but he made no move to return to the warmth and dryness of his car. "Ma-am," he said in the gentle Texas drawl that had made him famous. That was the most beautiful version of that song I've ever heard, and I ought to know since I wrote it. Martha looked up, and when her eyes met those of the king of country music, her hands began to shake, not from nerves or star-struck excitement, but from the recognition that something extraordinary was about to happen in her ordinary, difficult life. "Mr. Strait," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. I cannot believe it. It's really you." George knelt down beside her, unmindful of the wet pavement soaking through his jeans. The crowd around them had begun to murmur as recognition spread, but he kept his focus entirely on Martha. "The pleasure is mine, ma-am. I am George, and I'd be honored to know your name." "Martha Johnson," she replied, still clutching her guitar case as if it were an anchor in a storm. "I've been playing your music for so many years, Mr. Strait. It means more to me than you could ever know." "Please, call me George," he said with genuine warmth. "And I think you were wrong about that. I think I am beginning to understand exactly how much it means to you. The way you played that song just now, it wasn't just music. It was something deeper." Tears began to mix with the raindrops on Martha's cheeks. "That song, Amarillo by Morning, it has been the soundtrack of my whole life with my husband Tom. We danced to it the night we met, had our first dance as husband and wife to it, sang it to our baby boy when he couldn't sleep." George felt his own throat tighten with emotion. He had written that song decades ago, inspired by his own experiences and observations of life, but hearing how it had woven itself into the fabric of someone else's love story gave it a meaning he had never fully appreciated. "Tell me about Tom," George said gently, sitting down on the wet sidewalk beside Martha, ignoring the shocked expressions of the onlookers who couldn't believe they were witnessing the king of country music having an intimate conversation on a Nashville street corner. Martha's eyes grew distant as she began to speak. "Tom was a carpenter, the kind of man who could build anything with his hands. Strong, gentle hands that could frame a house in the morning and play guitar so sweetly in the evening that it would make angels weep. We had 47 beautiful years together, George. 47 years of waking up every morning grateful for the gift of loving and being loved by my best friend." She paused, gathering strength for the harder parts of her story. "Our son David grew up hearing your music in our house. Tom would sing Amarillo by Morning while he worked on projects, and David would follow him around, hammering on little pieces of wood, trying to help his daddy build things. David became an engineer, you know. Said he got his love of creating things from his father." George waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story and that it would be painful to tell. 3 years ago, David was driving home from work on a rainy night, not unlike this one, Martha continued, her voice growing smaller. "An 18-wheeler jackknifed on the interstate, and our beautiful boy didn't make it home that night." The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief. George had lost people he loved too, and he recognized the particular quality of sadness that comes from burying a child, a loss that defies the natural order of things. "Tom never recovered from losing David," Martha went on. "Oh, he tried to be strong for me, but I could see something break inside him that night we got the call. Within 6 months, he started forgetting things. Little things at first, like where he put his tools or what day it was. But then bigger things, more important things. He started forgetting conversations we'd had, forgetting the names of friends we'd known for decades." Martha's hands moved to touch her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had grown thin from decades of wear. "The doctors said it was Alzheimer's, probably accelerated by the trauma of losing David. Tom fought it as long as he could, but eventually I couldn't take care of him safely at home anymore. He's at Sunset Manor now, and the care there is wonderful. But it is expensive, George. More expensive than a retired school teacher and carpenter ever planned for." George began to understand why Martha was on the street with her guitar, and his admiration for her dignity and determination grew with each word she spoke. "I sold our house, our car, everything we owned to make sure Tom gets the best care possible," Martha said, her voice growing stronger with pride rather than self-pity. "And I play music on the streets because music is what I have to give. It is what we always had to give. The money people donate helps me visit Tom every day and buy him little things that make him comfortable, like his favorite cookies or a new pair of pajamas when his others wear out." "But here's the thing, George," Martha said, turning to look directly at him, her blue eyes bright with love that transcended grief. "Even with the Alzheimer, even when Tom doesn't he remember my name or recognize my face when I play Amarillo by Morning. For him, something in his eyes lights up. He may not remember that we danced to that song 50 years ago, but somewhere deep in his heart, he remembers the feeling of being loved." George found himself struggling to maintain his composure. In all his years in the music business, through all the awards and accolades, he had never received a review of his work that moved him as deeply as Martha's simple testimony about the power of his song to reach through the darkness of disease and touch whatever spark of love remained in her husband's fading mind. "Martha," he said finally, "I need you to know something. I've been making music for over 40 years, and I've been blessed with more success than any man has a right to expect. But sitting here with you, listening to your story, I'm realizing that I had forgotten something important. I had forgotten that the real measure of a song isn't how many records it sells or how high it climbs on the charts. The real measure is whether it helps people love each other better." The crowd around them had grown larger, but it remained respectfully quiet. Even Brad Mitchell and his colleagues had stopped their mocking commentary, though they still wore expressions of confusion and disbelief at the scene unfolding before them. "Your song did that for us, George," Martha said softly. "For 50 years, your song helped Tom and me love each other better, and now, even when everything else is slipping away, it is still doing that." George stood up slowly, rainwater dripping from his hat, and extended his hand to help Martha to her feet. "Martha Johnson," he said with quiet conviction, "I think it's time the world heard your story. And I think it's time I remembered what country music is really supposed to be about." As Martha accepted his hand and stood up, neither of them could have imagined how this chance encounter would transform not only their own lives, but also touch the hearts of millions of people who were about to witness something truly extraordinary. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the previous day's rain. Martha had barely slept, replaying her conversation with George Strait over and over in her mind, wondering if it had all been a beautiful dream. But the business card he had pressed into her hand before returning to his car was real enough, embossed with his name and a phone number written in his own careful handwriting. She arrived at her usual corner earlier than normal, hoping to catch the morning commuter traffic before heading to Sunset Manor for her daily visit with Tom. As she set up her guitar case and tuned her instrument, Martha noticed that word of yesterday's encounter had somehow spread. Several people with phones were already waiting, clearly hoping to witness or record another magical moment. But the first people to arrive at her corner were not friendly faces. Brad Mitchell and his two colleagues from Pinnacle Records approached with the same arrogant swagger they had displayed the day before, apparently undeterred by having witnessed George Strait's obvious respect for the woman they had mocked. "Well, well," Brad said loudly, pulling out his phone to record. "If it isn't Nashville's newest celebrity street performer, I guess even George Strait feels sorry for homeless people sometimes." His companion, a thin man named Kevin Walsh, whose expensive boots had never seen a day of honest work, laughed harshly. Probably just good publicity for him. You know how these old-school country stars need to stay relevant. What better way than pretending to care about some nobody playing covers on the street? Martha felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger, but she kept her dignity intact, quietly beginning to tune her guitar. She had faced bullies before in her teaching career and had learned that responding with grace often proved more powerful than returning cruelty with cruelty. The third man, Derek Phillips, who wore his Pinnacle Records badge like a badge of honor, decided to escalate the situation. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, "maybe you should stick to playing at nursing homes. I bet they appreciate elevator music more than real music lovers do." Several passers-by stopped to watch the confrontation, their expressions showing disapproval of the young man's behavior. But Derek seemed encouraged by the attention and continued his verbal assault. "I mean, seriously, lady, don't you think it's time to hang up the guitar and let real musicians take over? Country music is evolving, and it doesn't need relics from the past cluttering up the streets." Martha's hands stilled on the guitar strings, and for a moment, the weight of their words threatened to crush the confidence that George Strait had helped her rediscover the day before. But then she remembered Tomich's face when he heard "Amarillo by Morning," the way his eyes had brightened during her last visit, and she found her strength again. Young man," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding respect in classrooms full of energetic children, "music isn't about age or trends or who decides what's relevant. Music is about truth and emotion and connecting human hearts across all the barriers that try to divide us." Brad scoffed. "Spare us the lecture, lady. We work in the music industry. We know what sells and what doesn't, and I can guarantee you that whatever you're repeddling here isn't going to make anyone any money." That was when a familiar voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "Is that right?" George Strait said, approaching the group with a purposeful stride that made even the cocky young executives take a step back. "And what exactly do you think makes music valuable, son?" The transformation in the three men was immediate and comical. Brad's phone nearly slipped from his suddenly trembling hands. Kevin's face went pale beneath his artificially bronzed tan, and Derek actually stumbled backward, almost falling over the guitar case. "Mr. Strait," Brad stammered, his arrogance evaporating like morning mist. We didn't know you were... we were just..." "You were just what?" "Idin," George asked, his voice carrying a steel edge that his fans rarely heard, but that could silence a rowdy honky-tonk with a single word. "You were just disrespecting a woman whose musical ability and life experience could teach all three of you more than you will learn in a decade of pushing papers at whatever record label employs you." Derek, apparently too shocked to exercise good judgment, decided to try to explain himself. "Sir, we work for Pinnacle Records, and we believe in maintaining certain standards." George's laugh was not pleasant. "Pinnacle Records? Well, isn't that interesting? I'll be sure to mention to Marcus Jennings next time I see him how his employees spend their time harassing street musicians. I'm sure the CEO of Pinnacle will be fascinated to hear about the standards you maintaining." The color drained completely from all three faces as they realized that George Strait was not only defending Martha, but also had direct access to their boss. The music industry was smaller than most people realized, especially at the executive level, and a single word from an artist of George's stature could end careers before they had truly begun. "Now," George continued, his voice growing warmer as he turned his attention to Martha, "I believe yesterday we discussed the possibility of you joining me for something special. Martha, would you do me the honor of performing with me at the Grand Ole Opry this Saturday night?" The crowd that had gathered around them gasped audibly. An invitation to perform at the Grand Ole Opry was the dream of every country musician. And here was George Strait extending that honor to a woman who had been playing on street corners just to visit her ailing husband. Martha's hands flew to her heart, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "George, I couldn't possibly... the Opry is sacred ground. You were just what?" George interrupted gently. A musician who understands what country music really means. A woman who has lived the stories that the rest of us try to write. Martha, the Opry stage has been graced by pretenders and professionals, but it needs more people like you, people who sing from their souls instead of their contracts. Brad Mitchell, desperate to salvage something from this disaster, made one final attempt to assert his relevance. Mr. Strait, surely you understand that the Opry has certain expectations about the caliber of performers. George turned to face the young executive with an expression that could have frozen the Cumberland River. Son, let me explain something to you about caliber. This woman has been married to the same man for 47 years. She has loved him through joy and heartbreak, through health and sickness, through wealth and poverty. She has given her life to teaching children about music and beauty and expression. She sold everything she owned to care for her husband when he couldn't care for himself. And she plays music on this street corner, not for fame or recognition, but because music is how she shows love to the world. The silence that followed was profound. Even the traffic seemed to quiet as George's words hung in the air like a benediction. Now, George continued, what exactly have any of you three accomplished that demonstrates that kind of character and dedication? What have you contributed to the world of music besides cynicism and cruelty? Derek, Kevin, and Brad stood frozen, unable to formulate any response that wouldn't make them look even more foolish than they already did. George turned back to Martha, his expression soft with genuine affection. Martha, I meant what I said yesterday about the world needing to hear your story, and I think it is time that some people in this industry remembered what real music sounds like. He gestured to Eddie, who had been waiting nearby with the car, and the driver approached carrying a microphone and a small, portable speaker system. Right here, right now, George announced to the growing crowd, I want everyone to hear what authentic country music sounds like. Martha, would you play Amarillo by Morning with me? And would you tell these people about Tom, and about love that endures even when everything else fades away? As Martha nodded through her tears and reached for her guitar, she had no idea that this impromptu performance was being broadcast live on social media by dozens of phones in the crowd, and that within hours her story would touch the hearts of millions of people around the world. Saturday night at the Grand Ole Opry arrived with an electricity in the air that even the seasoned staff could feel. Word of George Strait's street corner encounter with Martha Johnson had spread throughout Nashville and beyond, thanks to the viral videos that had accumulated millions of views in just 5 days. The Opry, that sacred circle of country music, was sold out, with fans traveling from across the country to witness what many were calling the most important performance in decades. Backstage, Martha sat in a dressing room that still felt surreal to her. The simple blue dress she wore had been a gift from George's wife, Norma, who had insisted on meeting the woman who had reminded her husband why he fell in love with music in the first place. Martha's silver hair had been styled by the Opry's own beautician, but she had insisted on keeping it simple, wanting to look like herself rather than some manufactured version of a performer. Her hands shook slightly as she held the same Martin guitar that had carried her through years of street performances. But now these tremors came from anticipation rather than cold or hunger. George had spent the week with her, not coaching her performance, but simply learning more about her story, about Tom, and about the life they had built together through music. Martha, George said, appearing in her doorway dressed in his signature black shirt and jeans, there's someone I'd like you to meet before we go on. He stepped aside to reveal a man in a wheelchair, flanked by 2 nurses from Sunset Manor. Martha's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the familiar blue eyes and gentle smile that had captured her heart 50 years earlier. Tom? She whispered, rising from her chair so quickly that her guitar nearly fell. For a moment, Tom's expression was confused, the fog of Alzheimer's clouding his recognition. But then Martha began to hum Amarillo by Morning, and something miraculous happened. The confusion lifted from Tom's eyes like sunrise burning through morning mist, and he smiled the same smile that had made her fall in love with him at that country dance so many years ago. "Martha, my beautiful Martha," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Are you going to sing our song tonight?" The nurses who had accompanied Tom exchanged amazed glances. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Tom's primary physician who had insisted on coming along, whispered to George, "He has been confused and agitated all week, but the moment we told him we were bringing him to hear Martha sing, he became lucid and calm. Music therapy is powerful, but I've never seen anything like this." Martha knelt beside Tom's wheelchair, taking his hands in hers. They were still strong, still the hands of a carpenter, though they trembled now with the progression of his disease. "I'm going to sing for you tonight, my love. I am going to sing our song on the biggest stage in country music, and I am going to tell everyone about the most wonderful man I've ever known." Tom's eyes filled with tears of recognition and love. "I may not remember everything, Martha, but I remember how much I love you. I remember that you are the best part of every song I've ever heard." George watched this reunion with tears streaming down his own cheeks, understanding that he was witnessing something far more valuable than any platinum album or #1 hit. This was love in its purest form, transcending illness and time and circumstance. The show began with traditional Opry fanfare, but everyone in the historic Ryman Auditorium knew they were there for something unprecedented. When George finally took the stage, the applause was thunderous, but he quickly gestured for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed venue, "tonight is different from any other night in my career. Tonight, I want to tell you about a woman who reminded me what country music really means." He proceeded to tell Martha's story, about Tom and their love affair with Amarillo by Morning, about David's tragic death and Tom's battle with Alzheimer's, about Martha's dignity in the face of hardship and her unwavering commitment to the man she loved. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. "Martha Johnson," George announced, "would you please join me on the Opry stage?" Martha walked out from the wings, her guitar in hand, and the standing ovation that greeted her lasted for nearly 5 minutes. She stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment, and looked out at the sea of faces that had come to hear her story. 50 years ago," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "a young carpenter asked me to dance to a song called Amarillo by Morning. And I said yes to that dance, and I've been saying yes to him every day since. Tonight, I want to sing that song not just for all of you, but for my husband Tom, who was watching from backstage and who taught me that real love doesn't end when life gets difficult. It just finds new ways to express itself." As Martha and George began to play, something magical happened in the Ryman Auditorium. The song that had been played thousands of times before suddenly felt brand new, infused with 5 decades of real love and genuine emotion. Martha's voice, weathered by age but strengthened by experience, told the story of every couple who had ever danced to that song, every person who had ever loved someone, through joy and sorrow. But the most extraordinary moment came during the final verse. From backstage, carried by the perfect acoustics of the historic venue, came Tom's voice, singing along with the words he somehow remembered despite everything his disease had taken from him. The audience could hear him, and many began to cry openly as they realized they were witnessing a love story that transcended every barrier that life could create. When the song ended, the silence was complete for several heartbeats before the most sustained applause in Opry history began. But Martha wasn't finished. She had one more surprise that even George didn't know about. "There was something else I want to share with you tonight," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yesterday, Mr. Strait told me that he is establishing the Martha and Tom Johnson Foundation for musicians in need, to help aging artists who find themselves struggling to make ends meet. But what he doesn't know is that I have been thinking about this all week, and I've realized that I don't want this foundation to just give handouts. I wanted to give something more valuable than money. She turned to look at George, her eyes bright with purpose. I want to teach young musicians about what real music means. I want to share what Tom and I learned in 50 years of loving each other through songs. I want to show them that the greatest music doesn't come from talent or technique, but from truth and authenticity and the courage to let your heart break open so that beauty can flow out. George's smile was radiant as he understood what Martha was proposing. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, I present to you the first artist in residence of the Johnson Foundation, Professor Martha Johnson, who will be teaching masterclasses in authentic country music storytelling right here in Nashville. The final surprise came as the curtains opened to reveal not just Tom in his wheelchair, but a full choir of residents from Sunset Manor, all wearing their Sunday best and ready to sing. As Martha led them in a final, triumphant chorus of Amarillo by Morning, the audience understood that they had witnessed something that would be talked about for generations. After the show, as Martha sat beside Tom's wheelchair in the quiet of the backstage area, he took her hand with surprising strength. "Martha," he said, his voice clear and present, "did we do good tonight?" "We did perfect, my love," she replied, kissing his forehead. "We did absolutely perfect." But 6 months later, the Johnson Foundation had received donations from around the world, not just from country music fans, but from anyone who had been touched by the story of love that endures despite every challenge life can create. Martha's teaching studio in Nashville had a waiting list of young musicians eager to learn not just how to play country music, but how to live the kind of authentic life that makes great music possible. And every evening, when her teaching was done, Martha would drive to Sunset Manor, where she would sit beside Tom's bed and play Amarillo by Morning on the same guitar that had carried them through 50 years of marriage. Some days Tom remembered who she was, and some days he didn't. But every single day when she played their song, love filled the room like morning light breaking through darkness. Strait had returned to touring with a renewed sense of purpose, often dedicating Amarillo by Morning to Martha and Tom, reminding his audiences that the greatest country songs are not just entertainment, but testimonies to the power of love to endure, to transform, and to triumph over every force that tries to diminish the human spirit. The story of Martha and Tom Johnson had become legend in Nashville, but more importantly, it had become inspiration for countless couples who learned that real love isn't measured by easy times, but by the choice to keep choosing each other, one song at a time, one day at a time, one morning at a time, until the sun finally sets on a life well lived and a love story well told.